says, Romans 12, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. These are all short, so I'm going to say it again. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. The next one is also from Romans chapter 7, verse 15. Paul says, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I'll say it again. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10. And you know, no one really knows exactly what Paul was dealing with. He referred to a thorn in the flesh, that an issue that was unresolved for him. It might have been physical. It might have been something attitudinal that he was referring to in Romans 7. But this is what he says. He says, 3 times I appealed to God about this, that it would leave me. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. So last week I mentioned author Brian McLaren's new book, Life After Doom, catchy title. The subtitle is Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And we talked about the importance of being light in this dark and heavy world and in helping each other to focus on beauty and goodness and laughter and joy. Well, I promise I won't quote Brian every week, but I'm going to begin today with the beginning of chapter 12 of this same book. The chapter is called Start with Step 1. And Brian writes, here is step 1 of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. Brian writes, I became part of the Alcoholics Anonymous community in a rather unexpected way. It wasn't through alcohol, but through friendship. And also through a stupid mistake. I was on the faculty of a local college at the time, teaching English and also helping to start a new congregation on the side. I showed up at my building one Monday morning at about 9:30 for a 10 o'clock meeting, or class rather. I was confused though. The hallways were dark and empty. I made my way to the main office. It was also dark and quiet. At the end of the hallway, I saw one light shining through a partially open door. I was about to go home, but I decided, well, what's going on? And I entered and found a colleague sitting with his feet up on the program director's desk. Ah, he said. So I wasn't the only idiot who didn't get the memo that school was closed today. He explained there was work being done on the building's water supply and that the school would be open the next morning as usual. We exchanged some banter and I turned to leave and he said, hey, Brian, you got a minute? And he took his feet off the desk. He said, you're religious, aren't you? It was less than a question than an accusation. I had often heard him express his disdain, his hatred for religion. Well, spiritual, I would say, said Brian. and I suppose religious too, depending on how you define it. I'm helping actually form a little new experimental church. This is really weird, said the guy. Can I trust you with something? I said, sure. He said, nobody else knows this, not even my mother. I haven't gone a single day without drinking since I was 12 years old, he said. Until 11 days ago, I started going to AA, and I've been sober for 10 days now. When I showed up this morning and saw that classes were canceled, I realized I had a free day with nothing to do, and for the last, he looked at his watch, 93 minutes. I've been sitting here feeling every cell in my body telling me to go and get drunk and make up for lost time. I nodded, said Brian. If you know anything about the AA program, it's really big on having a higher power. But I'm an atheist, the man said. And I don't really believe in any of that crap. So for the last 93 minutes, I've been sitting here trying to keep my rear end in this chair 1 minute at a time, thinking today might be the end of the longest string of sober days in my whole life. They teach you this prayer in the program, he said, which I've been sitting here saying, even though I have a major problem with the whole higher power thing, as I told you. So here I am praying to a higher power I'm pretty sure doesn't exist. And then who walks in but the only God guy on the whole darn faculty? Pretty weird, right? Yeah, pretty weird, I agreed. And he said, is there any chance, I know this is asking a lot, but the first AA meeting nearby is at noon. Is there any chance you'd hang out with me until that meeting? I mean, just to make sure I don't take any detours, you know. I'm kind of on the edge. So, writes Brian, we went out for breakfast, and then I walked him to his meeting in the basement of a Catholic church, and he invited me to come in. He said, you can leave anytime if you don't like it. And that next hour had a huge impact on my life. Banged up metal folding chairs in a circle, a coffee pot on a cheap card table with way too strong black brew, and about 30 people who had a capacity for cussing that was only surpassed by their capacity for honesty. I mean, I'd never experienced anything quite like it. As a God guy who had a conflicted relationship with both Christianity and the conventional idea of church, I felt I had stumbled into something life-changing. To this day, I have never been drunk even once. This is Brian. But as I sat in my rickety folding chair and read a handout with the 12 steps, I knew immediately I belonged in this circle. The 12 steps felt incredibly relevant to my life and to the lives of everyone I knew. I accompanied my friend to a few more meetings in the coming months, and sometime later I shared my experience in a sermon. And soon after, several members of my congregation took me aside and said that they were part of the program too, and I started receiving invitations to accompany church members to a meeting where they would receive a chip for 30 days or be sober for a year or something like that. And members of the program began inviting other members of their program meetings to come to our church. And before I knew it, our church was full of people from AA. And I'll tell you what, our church got a whole lot more spiritual. I found that a church that welcomes people like us, they would say, and soon I was regularly invited to speak at 12-step retreats, helping people like my teaching colleague try to grapple with the whole higher power thing in a way that didn't give them hives and that felt honest and true. When someone from a local 12-step group would relapse and die of an overdose, I was often asked to perform the funeral. And I had the privilege of performing quite a few weddings for people in the program, too. Through the years, there was a growing overlap between my congregation and local addiction recovery programs, and I always felt the relationship was mutually beneficial. During my 24 years as a pastor, one of the highest compliments our congregation ever received was, "Wow, this church kind of feels like a 12-step meeting." The prayer my atheist colleague learned with great reluctance initially to pray in the program is called the Serenity Prayer, written by a 20th century United Church of Christ pastor named Reinhold Niebuhr. Some of you probably know the prayer. It says, "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." It's a long quote, but it was worth it. I chose to share this quote from Brian's book today for two primary reasons. First, because I knew that we would be hearing about Recovery High School this morning, and I don't know about the spirituality, whether that's even allowed to be a part of that program, but I'm sure they're all aimed in the direction where a relationship with a higher power would make sense. But also more so because I'm a huge fan of the 12-step program. I know a good deal about this topic and the whole reality and process of recovery because I participate regularly in more than one 12-step program myself. And if you're curious about which ones, you can ask me later. It's not a secret. I'm neither proud nor ashamed of this aspect of my life's journey. But I am incredibly grateful for it. And this may sound a little strange, so please listen carefully. I'm grateful that my life's journey has included the experience of being driven to the very end of myself by my addictions, plural, so that I could learn how to recognize them for what they are and get out of denial, which really just means to stop lying to myself about certain things. And more amazingly, so that I could grow into a deeper experience of being set free and experience what Paul in the scriptures was writing about when he said, "I asked God a bunch of times to just take this thing away from me. But God said, my grace is and will be sufficient, enough for you. But my power, God's power, the power we all need that can truly liberate us from anything that's threatening our well-being, our health, God's power is somehow opened up, made accessible, made available, made perfect. The word means mature, complete. When we acknowledge our weakness, God's power is made perfect somehow in our powerlessness. That's when the healings and the transforming miracles of grace happen. When we're at the end of ourselves, stop trying to pull it off. Stop thinking that the change we really need the most is a matter of a few small repairs. When what's really needed is a complete different way of thinking, renewing of the mind, a different way of living, which I'm sure is what Jesus meant when he talked about being born again. You might have to unlearn how you've been doing life, how you've been approaching things, how you've been thinking about certain things in order to get free. It's not going to just be a small little improvement. In other words, you got to get to a point where you're willing to say, God, help me, please. And that reminds me of a joke. Now, most of you have probably heard the joke. This guy he's hiking and he falls off the trail or whatever, and he down a ravine and finds himself hanging onto a cliff, and he cries out, help, help, and there's no one around, and finally says, God, and he didn't believe in God. Is there anyone up there? And he hears a voice, and the voice says, it's me, God. And then the voice says, all you need to do is let go and trust that I will catch you. At which point the guy says, is there anyone else up there? If you take nothing else away this morning, work with that. I mean, it's profound, Because a lot of times, I mean, there may be a solution, and it's not what we want. And we're not willing. And that's why in A, one of the big slogans is willingness is the key. When you finally get to a place where you're desperate enough, they call it the gift of desperation, that you'll do anything, whatever it takes, then we might get somewhere. All right, now why am I getting all this? As I said, part of it because we're talking about recovery in this high school, but Brian's book is about climate change. Now, you ready for whiplash here? He said that his studies about climate change have driven him back to the sweet spot of truth that recovery programs are all about. He said, we are not willing to tell ourselves the truth about our situation, and more specifically about our addiction to cheap energy. Now, Nadia Bolz-Weber always quotes Jesus in John 8 when he says, you'll know the truth and the truth will make you free, but first it'll make you miserable, according to Nadia. And that's kind of where we're going. And I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing that, I don't want to keep you here too long. But one more quick quote. Consider this. To produce the same amount of energy stored in 1 barrel of oil, a single bicyclist, would have to work 40 hours per week for between 5 and 9 years. As I write, an employer could buy that much power for about $75. No wonder the average American would feel powerless if they were deprived of their usual 2.6 gallons of fossil fuels per day, 5 times the global average. No wonder the managers of the global economy deny reality rather than waking up and dealing with the truth about our situation. Fossil fuels have become an addictive substance for our civilization. They are the fentanyl, heroin, or crack of energy sources. Just as American slave owners were so dependent on the social and economic arrangement of slavery that they were willing to tear apart their nation, risk their own lives, and take others' lives to maintain it, they were addicted to the lifestyle that the heinous exploitation of human labor known as chattel slavery afforded them. They could not imagine life without the ability to literally own another human. They considered slave ownership to be a God-given right. So in the interest of time, I'll just make the point. He's saying, we are at a point where we have to acknowledge our addiction as a society and as a world. Because even the way that we're trying to make changes with so-called clean energy, he has a whole piece about, folks, we have to stop kidding ourselves that clean energy is clean. Even if we were to stop fossil fuels completely and transfer to solar and wind and all the other forms of energy, we cannot keep using energy the way we do. And this is all of us. I felt so convicted, doggone. I just drove 6,000 miles on my vacation. And he said, what we have to start realizing is that if we're serious and we're going to have the conversation that the world needs us to have, we have to deal with our addiction to our own personal autonomy. That I can go wherever I want to go, however I want to get there, whenever I want to do it, and do whatever I want to do. The world can't afford that. I don't even, if we were really serious, I don't even know that, I mean, I'd have to move to McFarland from Madison, even to just get to my work. So let's go back, let's end with the cliff again. We keep on asking for solutions, and what we're really saying to God and to ourselves often is there anyone else up there? Because we don't like the answer that truthful analysis gives us. And then Brian is saying, so you know what it's going to take? It's going to take us all saying, I don't know how to do this. I don't think I can. I don't know the first thing about, tell me what to do. Somebody, tell me what to do. Give me a program to follow. And then Brian says the problem is there's no program for this. But it starts by us being honest and us saying, hey, what does it mean for us to hear the message from the cliff that we don't want to hear and be willing to fall into the arms of God here? And all I want to say in closing, I'm smiling because if I believe anything, it's that God will always catch us. That doesn't mean rescue us. But no matter what, we fall into God. That's a safe place. That's a beautiful place to start. And I gotta stop. So I will. May the Spirit speak to you what you need to hear this morning. Amen.